Every day, millions of people scroll through their feeds. Someone posts a video, someone shares an article, someone makes a claim. It sounds believable, it sounds convincing, and within minutes, the comments begin. That's a lie. No, it's true. Prove it. We've all seen it. Maybe you've even been part of it, whether it's on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, X, or the news. The same argument keeps repeating itself. Not just who's right, but something much bigger. Who gets to decide what's true? Most of us know the First Amendment protects an extraordinary amount of speech. We expect disagreement. We expect debate. But we also know free speech isn't the same thing as speech without consequences. If you knowingly lie under oath in court, that can be a crime. If you knowingly make certain false statements to federal investigators, that also can be a crime. So here's what didn't make sense to me. Every year, members of Congress are accused of making statements that critics say are false. Sometimes they're fact-checked, sometimes they're publicly contradicted. Sometimes they're even accused of lying by members of their own party. Yet, you've probably never heard of a member of Congress being criminally prosecuted simply for something said during a debate on the House or Senate floor. So why is Congress different? That question stayed with me. The more I thought about it, the less it made sense. Well, at first I thought this was going to have a simple answer. It didn't. In fact, the deeper I dug, the bigger the question became. So stay with me because this gets deeper. I decided to investigate, and what I discovered completely changed the question I thought I was asking. Because this isn't really a story about politicians. It's a story about power. Who has it, who doesn't, and how far we're willing to let government go when political speech is involved. By the end of this video, I think you'll see this question very differently. To answer that question, we have to start in the only place that matters. Not social media, not cable news, not opinion columns, the Constitution itself. I assumed the answer would be buried somewhere in a complicated Supreme Court decision. Well, it wasn't. It had been sitting in the Constitution all along. In Article 1, Section 6, it says, "For any speech or debate in either house, they shall not be questioned in any other place." That's it. Just one sentence. But that single sentence has shaped constitutional debate for more than 2 centuries. Maybe you're thinking, wait a second, doesn't that mean Congress can simply say whatever it wants? If you're asking that, you're asking exactly the question I asked. But that's not what the Constitution actually says. So what does it mean? Here's how I finally came to understand it. In plain English, members of Congress generally cannot be questioned in another branch of government simply because of what they say while carrying out legitimate legislative duties. Now, read that sentence again. Notice what's missing. The Constitution never says members of Congress may lie. In fact, it never uses the word lie. So why has this one sentence created so much confusion? Because there's another question hiding underneath it, a much more important one. Why would the framers write a protection like this in the first place? If honesty mattered to them, why create a rule that feels so uncomfortable today? How do you create a government powerful enough to govern without making it powerful enough to destroy freedom? To understand why those words ended up in the Constitution, you have to forget almost everything you know about today's politics. Forget today's parties, forget today's headlines, forget today's arguments. Instead, imagine it's the summer of 1787. The American Revolution is over. The colonies have won their independence, but winning the war turned out to be the easy part. Now, they had to build a government, not just any government, one strong enough to survive without becoming the very thing they had just fought to escape. That's the challenge facing the delegates gathered in Philadelphia. They weren't trying to create a perfect government. They knew that wasn't possible. They were trying to answer a much harder question. How do you create a government powerful enough to govern without making it powerful enough to become the next tyranny? For many of the men in that room, this wasn't an abstract political debate. It was personal. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that criticizing your government could cost you your livelihood, your freedom, or worse. To many of the framers, that wasn't imagination. It was memory. They had lived under a government they believed had abused its authority. They had seen what happened when power stopped accepting criticism. That lesson shaped everything they were about to write. As the delegates debated the structure of this new government, they kept returning to the same concern. How do you prevent one branch of government from intimidating another? How do you protect vigorous debate without protecting corruption? How do you encourage honest disagreement without giving those in power the ability to punish their political opponents? Those aren't easy questions. In fact, they may not have perfect answers. That's why the Constitution is filled with trade-offs: liberty and order, power and restraint, freedom and accountability. The speech or debate clause is one of those trade-offs. At first, I assumed it was written to protect politicians, but the more I studied it, the more I realized I had it backwards. It wasn't written to protect individual politicians. It was written to protect the independence of Congress itself. Think of it this way. Imagine a championship football game where one team has the power to fire the referees every time it disagrees with a call. Would anyone trust the outcome? Well, of course not. Now, imagine one branch of government had the power to investigate, prosecute, or intimidate members of another branch simply because it didn't like what they said during a legislative debate. Would Congress really be independent? Or would every difficult speech come with the fear of retaliation? Suddenly, that one sentence in Article 1 begins to look very different. The framers weren't asking, how do we protect dishonest politicians? They were asking, how do we protect the people's representatives from a government that might someday punish political speech? That's a completely different question. And once I understood that, I realized something else. This protection wasn't created because the framers trusted politicians. History suggests they trusted concentrated power even less. But if that's true, another question immediately appears. If this protection exists, where does it end? Who decides what counts as legitimate legislative speech and what doesn't? That's exactly the question the Supreme Court would eventually have to answer. Now we know why the framers wrote the speech or debate clause, but knowing why they wrote it isn't the same as knowing how far it goes. Imagine someone handed you the Constitution, pointed to that single sentence, and asked, what exactly does this protect? At first, the answer seems obvious. A speech on the House floor? Probably protected. Debating a bill? That makes sense. Serving on a committee? Most people probably would agree. But then the questions become more difficult. What about a press conference, a television interview, a campaign rally, a podcast, a newsletter, a social media post? Suddenly, that one sentence isn't nearly as simple as it first appeared. And that's exactly the challenge the Supreme Court has faced for more than 2 centuries. Case after case, the court kept returning to the same question. Not, was this statement true? Not, was this statement false? Not even, did we agree with what was said? Instead, the court kept asking one remarkably consistent question. Was this part of the legislative process? That question changes everything. Let's test it. Imagine a member of Congress standing on the House floor arguing for or against a bill. Protected? Generally, yes. That's exactly what legislators were elected to do. Now, imagine that same member serves on a committee, questions witnesses, or participates in an official congressional investigation. Again, those activities are generally protected because they're part of the legislative process. So far, the pattern seems clear. But now let's change just one thing. The member leaves the Capitol. A television camera is waiting outside. The reporter asks the same question. The member gives the same answer. The opinion hasn't changed. The words haven't changed. The person hasn't changed. Only one thing has changed: the role. The member is no longer participating in an official legislative proceeding. They're speaking publicly. That distinction may seem small. Constitutionally, it's enormous. The speech or debate clause wasn't written to protect every public statement made by a member of Congress. It was written to protect the legislative process itself. That's the principle the Supreme Court has consistently recognized. And once you see that distinction, many of these cases suddenly make much more sense. But there's another misunderstanding that's just as common. Some people hear about the speech or debate clause and assume members of Congress are somehow above the law. They're not. Members of Congress can still be investigated for crimes. They can still be prosecuted for conduct outside protective legislative activity. They can still face ethics investigations. They can be censured. They can even be expelled by their own chamber. In every election, they remain accountable to the people who sent them there. The speech or debate clause was never intended to eliminate accountability. Its purpose is much narrower: to prevent another branch of government from using the legal system to interfere with legitimate legislative work. And that's when I realized something. The Constitution wasn't trying to answer every question about honesty. It was answering a much more specific question. Who gets to interfere with the work of Congress? The framers' answer was clear. Not the executive, not the judiciary, not because of legitimate legislative speech. Whether that trade-off is still the right one is something every generation has to decide for itself, including ours. By now, you may still be thinking, I'm not sure I like this. That's a perfectly reasonable reaction. In fact, I think you're supposed to feel that way, because every constitutional protection comes with a cost. Freedom of speech means protecting speech we sometimes dislike. Freedom of the press means protecting reporting that may be wrong, unfair, or deeply unpopular. Protection against unreasonable searches sometimes means evidence can't be used because the government violated constitutional limits. The right to remain silent means people don't have to build the case against themselves. None of those outcomes feel satisfying every time, but the Constitution was never designed to guarantee satisfying outcomes. It was designed to place limits on power. Sometimes those limits are frustrating. Sometimes they protect people we disagree with. Sometimes they protect ideas we find offensive. That's the price of living in a free society. The speech or debate clause asks us to confront that same reality. Would we rather risk protecting some legislative speech that may be false, or give another branch of government the power to decide when legislative speech deserves punishment? That's not an easy choice. The framers knew it wasn't. They weren't writing for perfect people. They were writing for imperfect people who would someday hold tremendous power, including people they would never meet, including people they might not even trust. That's why the Constitution is built on an idea that appears again and again. Don't assume power will always be exercised wisely. Limit it, separate it, balance it. Because history has shown that power rarely stays exactly where it's placed. It grows unless something stops it. That doesn't mean the framers expected members of Congress to be honest all the time. They didn't write the Constitution because they trusted politicians. They wrote it because they understood human nature. And human nature doesn't change very much. People seek influence, people defend their interests, people sometimes abuse authority. The Constitution doesn't pretend otherwise. Instead, it tries to make sure no single person, no single office, and no single branch holds enough power to silence the others. That's the deeper purpose behind the speech or debate clause. Not protecting dishonesty, protecting the independence of the legislative branch from retaliation by the others. You may believe the framers struck exactly the right balance. You may believe they didn't. Reasonable people have debated that for more than 2 centuries. The important thing is understanding what problem they were trying to solve before deciding whether they solved it well. And that brings us back to the world we're living in today. Open your phone, scroll for 30 seconds. You'll probably see someone making a claim, someone else calling it false, someone demanding that it be removed, someone else insisting it should stay. The technology has changed. Human nature hasn't. The framers never imagined smartphones or podcasts or live streams or artificial intelligence, but they understood something that still matters today. Power has always been tempted to silence criticism. That's why this conversation isn't really about one member of Congress or one political party or one election. It's about a question every free society eventually has to answer. Who should have the power to decide when political speech deserves punishment? The Constitution doesn't give us an easy answer. Instead, it gives us a framework built on the belief that concentrating too much power in any one place is itself a danger. You may agree with where the framers drew that line. You may think they drew it in the wrong place. Reasonable people have debated that question for more than 200 years, and they'll probably continue debating it long after we're gone. But here's what changed for me. I started this investigation wanting to answer just a simple question. Does the Constitution protect congressional lies? What I discovered was a much deeper question. How do you protect political freedom without giving someone the power to decide which political ideas may safely be spoken? Whether you agree with the framers' answer or not, I think it's a question worth wrestling with, because once we stop asking it, we risk forgetting why the Constitution was written the way it was in the first place. If this investigation made you think, I hope you'll subscribe and join us. This channel isn't about telling you what to think. It's about exploring important questions with curiosity, evidence, and an open mind. And if you'd like to continue this investigation, check out this next video. It explores why so many people react before they think, and why that may be one of the biggest challenges facing our society today. I'll see you there.